Hi, I'm Dr. Mercola, and I want to thank you for joining us on the next episode of Diet Against Disease. The first episode took you on a journey filled with emotions as you watched many testimonials of individuals and families who believed in a system that failed them. They struggled, lost hope, and for some experienced a deep sense of loss that will be with them for the rest of their lives. You also experienced a deeper feeling of triumph over tragedy as you witnessed the unveiling of a dietary approach that has hope and promise for your future. Up until now, a cyclical, ketogenic, or low-carb diet has been vilified and misunderstood in its ability to create internal healing for a wide range of common diseases. It's been shown to actually reduce inflammation that can lead to diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, and congestive heart failure. It can eliminate joint swelling so you can wean off medications and return to the activities that you enjoy. It can force your body to use fat as its primary fuel with the benefit of not experiencing blood sugar spikes that are the hallmarks of a high-carb diet, in addition to successful and long-term weight loss.
The whole explosion in Alzheimer's, I think, can be successfully treated with it. You look at the preliminary work in there, and holy cow, people don't have to let their minds go like that.
Nature is telling us that there should not be a degenerative aging process. Life should be bursts of life.
It's generally offered as the last option. Oh, every single medicine we tried has failed. Well, maybe we could try ketogenic dieting. By the time that's happened, irreparable damage has been done. So it should be the first line of treatment. Food can be medicine.
I've worked with those parents, I've worked with those patients, I've worked with those doctors, and I knew that it was considered to be outside the box. But I also knew that there were some brilliant successes.
I lost my whole left side to the point where I couldn't even swallow. I had to put a feeding tube in.
He was laid out in his bed and had tubes everywhere, and he was going back for brain imaging. And we just had a discussion about, either he can check out now and he can give up and let his body go, or this is his opportunity to show his family and his grandchildren the most incredible journey that a human can take and the most courageous thing somebody can do, which is go after health and healing when there is zero odds.
It's been over the last 5 years that we have seen patient after patient after patient who actually has devastation in their lives or devastation in their families, and who has done very well. And it's just hearing those stories again and again which has been so exciting. We had one guy who said that he has allowed himself to think about the future and to talk about the future with his grandchildren once again. He had actually stopped because he wouldn't talk to them about the future because he knew that he would not be part of it. And now he's allowed himself to do that. We had another woman who said that her husband is an excellent guitarist, and he had lost that ability, and that he now got the nuance in his guitar playing back again. Another woman who actually had lost her ability to play the piano, and that came back. A woman who had lost her ability to speak a foreign language, which she had been very good at when she was young. She actually learned to speak both Chinese and Russian, and these started to come back as she improved. So the stories are just heartwarming and very exciting to hear. And of course, from the other parts of the family member, one girl said that her mother had become part of the family once again. So these are really exciting to hear.
Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and I hope you're enjoying the free series. And I want to give a special thank you to those of you that purchased the Fat for Fuel online course. Your support allows us to keep getting this message out to the world for free. The online course is designed to help you implement the tools and principles you've learned in Diet Against Disease so you can start achieving your health goals today. So take advantage of this limited time, massive savings during this free screening of Diet Against Disease. Learn more by clicking the link below. So in this next episode, we're going to dive deep into some of the most frustrating neurological diseases like dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and even seizures. We will also explore the effects on advanced aging and what we can do to help stop and even reverse the clock. By embracing natural and alternative solutions within our current failed conventional medical system, you will feel inspired and empowered, knowing that healing starts with you.
Sadly, many of us have experienced it. That heartbreaking moment when someone you love can't remember who you are. That moment when your loved one is acting like someone totally different because of the degeneration of their brain.
My husband Steve, when he was about 51 years old, he began having memory issues, making payroll mistakes, having trouble organizing his accounting, and then he began forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office, which was very odd. He was only 2 years older than me, and I didn't think I would forget that type of thing. And at first we attributed it to depression, but he kept getting worse. And you know, he's my best friend. He was my best friend, and you know, for many years it was horrible to see him fading away like that. He was very depressed. Eventually, as Alzheimer's took its toll, he didn't recognize my face anymore. It's so strange, and the first time it happened that he didn't recognize me, it was on Christmas Day, and it was particularly devastating. I'll just never forget it. Basically, in our bathroom with a large mirror, and he said, he asked me if I was the one, is how he put it. And I said, yes, I'm the one. I wasn't sure what he meant. He said, no, you're not. And you know, that day he didn't know who I was. And that was the first day that had happened. And it was crushing. It was just crushing.
I can tell you that, you know, for me, when I was ravaged with, you know, I had multiple chemical sensitivity. I was allergic to everything. I was covered with rashes and hives. I couldn't get out of a chair for a year. And with all that inflammation, it was eating out my brain. And I could not safely drive a car. I lost the ability to parallel park or back up. I could no longer do it. I couldn't sequence all the things happening to drive a car. I couldn't remember how to do things on a computer, and I'm pretty decent on a computer. And I could hardly dial a phone number. I mean, just trying to hold those numbers in my head, I would get confused and sometimes have to dial several times. And for me, what happened is I, you know, healed what was going on in my body. Then, you know, various factors, my brain came back online. And I remember the day that I could hold the phone number in my head, the 7 digits, and dial the phone number again. And that was like a miracle.
I mean, I'd be drooling in a nursing home by now if I hadn't have learned functional medicine and done everything I did. I was in my early 50s when I was ill in that way, and when I treat people with dementia in their early 50s, it goes very quickly.
Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and if you're enjoying the education provided in this free film series, please share it with your loved ones by clicking on the link below. It makes a massive difference as you'll be providing them with potentially life-altering information to help them take control of their health.
So I've had many opportunities to touch many, children and families, with autism and other neurotoxic disorders. I mean, it's not just autism. This is an epidemic that's affecting the planet. And I believe in my heart that I do have an answer. I would never say I have all the answers, but what I learned out of my own pain and suffering, is what I'm called to take to the world. I know that. He was on the autism spectrum. I don't even know that I would have been able to inspire him to move forward at times. I remember there was a time where I sat next to him on the bed and I said, Dylan, do you want to get well? Because he was crying. He had to eat different than the other kids. He had to do different things that he didn't like to do. We had this 4-to-1 ratio fat that is, dramatic, for fixing the brain, and it was horrible tasting, right? I mean, there's easier methods today, but he would take it on the spoon, he would cry, and I remember sitting next to him, and I remember saying, I understand, because, he knew to the best of his ability my story, and I would never have been able to inspire him. I would never been able to relate to him. Obviously, I'd never been able to fix him if I didn't go through, what I went through. But, that day, he said, he just looked at me and he shook his head yes. And I was always able to anchor back to that. Remember that conversation. And it's interesting because I just recently had an interview of my whole family. And, it was remarkable because as I looked down to my kids, there's literally a neurotoxic story with each person, including my wife and all of my children. And that's a whole other story that we can get to. But, Dylan had spoke the words. He said, yeah, I remember that. He's more than healed. You would never know Dylan as having any problems whatsoever.
Have you seen the devastating impacts of Alzheimer's? What does it look like for people that are experiencing this?
Well, I've learned about the devastating impact of Alzheimer's. I was offered a research chair opportunity at the university that hired me 13 years ago. I think we've all had that experience now. It's a common 21st century experience. And for me, what was always remarkable was not so much the decline and the sorrow, the sadness of that experience, but the moments when there was a lightening up. Someone was remembering something, someone was actually normal for 5 or 10 minutes. And then it was gone. And of course, maybe that makes it more tragic in some ways, but what it encouraged me to think is that if we could extend that period when the connection was being made, the brain cells that made that connection once, maybe we can get them to do it again this afternoon or tomorrow. And how do we exploit that? Because something residual is still working. The light isn't gone out entirely. The switch needs to be put on, but the light bulb is still there. How do we make that work again?
When did you start seeing the problem there with your mother?
Quite quickly after she got out of the hospital. It wasn't, she knew what was going on. It wasn't like it wasn't from like an outside looking in. She realized that she was having some memory problems as well, and we would have conversations, and then about 3 hours later, she'd forget what I had talked to her about, which can be heartbreaking, frustrating, upsetting, all those kinds of things when you see a family member that's kind of suffering a little bit. But yeah, it was really just the dementia. It was really just the memory. She couldn't remember just the little things. It wasn't like she'd completely forget hours and hours of time, but it was enough to really affect her lifestyle and the family dynamic for sure.
You love your mum, don't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And for you to picture her being in an old person's nursing home,
yeah.
Like what does that image feel like for you?
Oh, that's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I was lucky enough to be about 16, 17 years old when my great-grandparents passed away. And I've seen them go through the whole nursing home system. And it was terrifying. So imagining someone who really isn't deserving to, not that deserving to be there.
Not old enough, right?
Old enough, exactly, old enough to be there is just terrifying. Yeah, it's a sad place.
And that's what we've tried to bring to it. So to try and bring a little bit of hope and to explore it in a rigorous way and to try to make progress at the same time, because Alzheimer's disease is always associated with a great deal of despair. And yet there were these moments that everyone can recount in their own personal experiences that suggested that there was something that could be captured if we could only extend that connection a little longer. And we thought that it had something to do with the way the brain cells talk to each other. And that takes fuel, and the fuel is normally a sugar called glucose.
You know, dementia is about cerebral glucose metabolism more than it is about beta amyloid or tau or any of that. Those are kind of symptoms of the problem. They're not the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is kind of the underlying lifestyle and diet. And if you go to that level of lifestyle and diet, look at it there, how can I feed the brain? How can I give my brain the energy that it needs? Because it's not doing so great with glucose right now. I'm not, it's not working, these cells are dying off. So you give it ketones.
When we got started in this field, nobody had used the ketogenic diet in Alzheimer's disease. The context for me was that this is not the first disease that this diet has been proposed for. It's nearly 100 years that the ketogenic diet has been used for epilepsy, to control epilepsy when the drugs don't work, which is a lot of the time. So there was quite an experience with this. It was kind of an orphan treatment. The drugs don't work, we'll try a second drug, try a third drug. Oh, well, we've heard of the ketogenic diet, let's try and implement it. And so I have worked with those parents, I've worked with those patients, I've worked with those doctors, and I knew that it was considered to be outside the box. But I also knew that there were some brilliant successes with epilepsy. So we said, well, let's learn about how this would work in Alzheimer's disease.
Isn't it incredible to think that the solution to Alzheimer's and many of these other neurological diseases could be something so simple: diet and lifestyle? The scientific community already has access to a wealth of research on how these principles have been used successfully for decades in the treatment of epilepsy. So why aren't the people who so desperately need this life-saving information being told about it?
Essentially what I've learned is this: science, traditional science as it stands, and like myself, I published over 200 papers, abstracts, and presented everywhere. But I learned that the only people that a lot of times science reaches are other scientists. And when I started studying ketogenic dieting, for example, I found that we've known about its ability to help with epilepsy for over 100 years. And yet, my cousin died of epilepsy, before he was 20, never had heard of a ketogenic diet.
How long ago was that?
That was a long time ago. It must have been like over 10 years ago.
Wow, he was your age then.
Yeah. He would have been about my age.
Did you grow up around him?
Yeah. Well, he was. I grew up around him, and so it was obviously super sad to see that happen.
Do you believe that your cousin would be alive today if he had have used this diet?
Yeah, there's a lot of research with. That's probably the most research ever been done in any cognitive disorder is epilepsy, and so we really are seeing like a ton of research with that. I do believe that he would be with us today. And I've seen so many studies about being in control, sometimes even completely getting rid of seizures altogether. So I definitely think it was a treatment, and he never had that option. It was never offered to him. And in fact, it's generally offered as the last option. Oh, every single medicine we tried has failed. Well, maybe we could try ketogenic dieting. By the time that's happened, irreparable damage has been done. So it should be the first line of treatment. I speak at conferences and I'll talk about ketogenic dieting. Last conference I went to, a guy came up to me and said, my daughter's 36 years old. She's on I don't know how many medications. She's had epilepsy her whole life. This is the first time I've heard about this. So what I've learned is that it's not enough to do experiments. It's not enough to do science. That does not mean it's going to get out there if no one can understand it. And so like our passion, like our goal, especially like our institute, like Applied Science Performance Institute, is just that, to apply it. Like to take stuff that's hardcore science that we do and translate it in English that people can understand. And so that's our passion. If we don't do that, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. It could be there for 100 years like a lot of these other research. It's not going to reach the people. And we want to empower people like on what you can actually do to potentially treat these diseases.
And so the different diseases that ketogenic diet can affect, you mentioned cancer, you mentioned Alzheimer's.
Yeah, all the neurodegenerative I think can benefit from low carb, if not ketogenic. So, and I think things like that get overlooked, and they're out there. People have been doing it for 15, 20 years. They've been using this diet to actually treat these diseases and get people off medications and get them healthier. The whole explosion in Alzheimer's, I think, can be successfely treated with it. You look at the preliminary work in there, and holy cow, people don't have to let their minds go like that. They can, if they just, they don't even have to be ketogenic. They just need to be low carb. They need to get rid of the stuff that's causing inflammation in their bodies and brains. And it's lifestyle. So once you're past that midpoint in your life, if you're not doing these things, if you're not changing your diet, if you're not exercising more, you're going to pay the price.
The analogy, to simplify it, is it's as if the gasoline filter in the car is dirty. The engine is all tuned up, and you've got an excellent race car driver, and you've got the tank full of gas, but the gas filter is dirty. And so you're not transferring the fuel to the brain in this analogy. And so you need a tool to find out if the gas filter is actually dirty in our brain. It's figuratively a gas filter. And that's what we developed. And we were strongly encouraged to find out that in fact it is possible to get the alternative ketone fuel into the Alzheimer brain, and it works perfectly well when you do that.
How many of us have not had problems remembering things? I mean, it just disappears. And wouldn't you like to have that ability to regain that function? Well, you can with a properly implemented cyclical ketogenic diet. Now, the cyclical ketogenic diet is a low-carb, high-fat, adequate protein diet. But the key is it's high fat, and fat has been vilified for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the primary person responsible for that is Ansel Keys, who was a very prominent nutrition researcher in the 1950s and 60s. And he was incredibly influential at shifting the whole focus and paradigm on fat, and he vilified saturated fat. And in some ways he was correct, not with the saturated fat, but the fact that fat was an issue. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, heart disease was very rare, but by the mid of the 20th century, around the time he started doing his research, heart disease had become an epidemic, as it still is today. It had risen dramatically. So Key's mistake is that he failed to understand or recognize that yes, indeed, it was fat, but it was a very specific type of fat. It was the vegetable oil fat. And as a substitute, they believed it was saturated fat and vilified that and replaced it with the vegetable oils, which were actually the cause of the problem, and even worse, these trans fats. And that's when margarine was in vogue, and it was being promoted as being heart healthy. So that is the challenge. That's the reason why we had this massive emphasis on the low-fat disease. And if you had adopted that, please forgive yourself, because most of us during this time period did too. I certainly did, and for many decades I had widely embraced the low-fat diet, and maybe that's one of the reasons I lost most of my hair. Who knows? I think it's probably genetic too. But nevertheless, it's a mistake, and if you have healthy fat, that is the key. Your body was designed to burn fat as your primary fuel.
If you go on the internet, Alzheimer's, not preventable, irreversible, and all of that is simply not the truth. Alzheimer's is absolutely preventable. Alzheimer's is reversible up to stage 5. There's 7 stages of Alzheimer's. Even stage 6, we can hold the line and prevent progression. Stage 5, we can roll Alzheimer's back and regain some of that memory. So Alzheimer's is absolutely preventable and is to a significant degree reversible.
That's amazing. Tell us, how can we fix it?
Well, diet is your number one thing. Diet is critical. So we briefly mentioned that when we talked about it being another name as diabetes type 3. So avoiding sugar and sugar spikes. Sugar spikes cause Alzheimer's, sugar spikes cause diabetes, sugar spikes cause cancer. Many, not singularly, but one of the factors. And so what is a sugar spike? A sugar spike is when we eat a certain substance and it spikes the blood sugar more than 20 points. So this is critical in my treatment of Alzheimer's patients and cancer patients and in preventing aging, everything that I do. So I'll actually tell my patients, go to the local pharmacy and get a blood sugar meter. Check your blood sugar, eat the bowl of whatever you're going to eat, quinoa or corn or potatoes or fruit or whatever. Set your timer for 20 minutes and check your blood sugar again. If your blood sugar went up over 20 points, you can't eat that. That's causing a sugar spike. Sugar spikes cause damage everywhere, from the brain to the pancreas to our little bitty blood vessels, our capillaries, nerves, sugar feeding cancer cells. Another critical element in diet is when not to eat. Because we not only want to be eating the right things, but fasting is a lost art in America. Hydration is huge. First of all, you're washing out toxins nicely, but DNA, for DNA to happen all day long, our cells are making DNA. Well, DNA looks like a rubber band wad inside of a cell and inside of the nucleus and inside of the mitochondria. And it literally has to unfold and string out for it to be copied, to create new structure, to create antibodies, whatever the cell, the body is creating, the cell is creating from that DNA. And then after it gets translated, it wads back up. Well, it can't, if things are dehydrated and it's compressed in there, it can't untangle itself, and so it needs, liquid is the medium in which everything happens in the body. Exercise is another one of those critical elements for the brain, for the body. There has never been a study done on exercise that showed it any detriment, and any study that I've ever read showed an improvement in whatever it was, from Alzheimer's to heart disease to atherosclerosis to diabetes. There is nothing that exercise doesn't help. Recently, one of my patients in her late 50s was experiencing some cognitive decline. She had noticed that she couldn't follow, having to take many more notes, and then pretty soon she was literally unable to work. We were able to reverse her cognitive decline using many of the techniques that I've just mentioned, and get her back to work, full-time back to work, instead of housebound, afraid that she would not find her way back home from the grocery store. A gentleman in his early 60s, big family history of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. Again, struggling. His wife wouldn't let him go out, wouldn't let him go to the grocery store by himself, so at least stage 5 Alzheimer's. He's back fully functioning, doesn't have to make lists anymore, finds his way back home from the grocery store just fine, and is helping remind her of things again, so she knows he's back because he's his old self reminding her to do things. And these are stories that happen every day. The reason I do what I do is for people. It's about caring for people. It's about helping people stay healthy.
Tell me how your mother turned her situation around.
Well, she saw her naturopathic doctor. They ran a whole bunch of tests, and they found that she had a vitamin B12 deficiency, which is super easy to fix, thank God. So within 2 weeks, she was back to normal. She was doing vitamin B12 shots twice a week intramuscularly, and within that she still does them, but within that 2 weeks, she was back to just the amazing person that she is. So that was fantastic. It was like magic. It was really cool actually to see. Yeah.
And do you remember what effect that had on? That's bringing up emotion for you. What is it?
It is, yeah, it is. I don't know. It's just sorry. Knowing what I know now about dementia and how it affects the person as well as the family, it's scary. So I'm glad that there was a simple solution to such a complicated problem.
Yeah. Help me understand what you're feeling right now.
Relief.
Yeah.
Yeah, but empathy for the people that go through that have dementia, that don't have a simple solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Knowing what I know now, and seeing, and having seen people go through what dementia actually does to a person, really, it's really scary and it's really heartbreaking. So I'm just glad that I got my mom back.
My husband Steve, in 2004, when he was only 54 years old, he was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And he had the early onset form of the disease, which happens in about 2% of people with Alzheimer's and people who are less than 65 years of age. I just happened upon this information about ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain on the internet. A press release about a medical food that was being studied. It wasn't going to be out for another year. It improved the memories of nearly half the people who took it with Alzheimer's disease. And I had to find out what it was. And I learned from their patent application that it was medium-chain triglyceride oil. And I was familiar with that because I'm a neonatologist. We used to add it to the feedings of our premature newborns, a little bit to each feeding, our tiniest ones, because they absorbed it very well and because it helped them grow faster. I knew that coconut oil was available over the counter, and I learned from the patent application that MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil, and coconut oil is about 60% medium-chain triglycerides. So he was scheduled for 2 screenings for 2 different clinical trials, 2 days in a row. And I learned this information the night before the first screening and didn't really have time to go out and do anything about it. The first screening, when we didn't have it available, He scored 2 points below the threshold that he needed to get into the clinical trial, and that was devastating. He was asked to draw a clock. He drew a few little random circles and a few numbers. I think it was 9, 10, 11, 12. Just a very random, nothing structured like a clock, and I was told that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So I thought, what do we have to lose? I'm going to pick up some coconut oil, and we stopped at a health food store on the way home, and the next morning, a few hours before he was scheduled for the screening, I put a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil in some oatmeal, and he ate that, and several hours later, he improved. We were in a different center than we were the previous day, but he remembered a different town that we were in. He remembered the day of the week. He remembered the season. He knew what floor we were on, and those were things that he could not remember the day before when he took the mini mental status test. And this time he scored 18, which was 2 points over the threshold to get into the clinical trial. So he was literally accepted into a clinical trial because of his response to simply taking coconut oil. And, at first, I wasn't 100% sure, did we just get very lucky or was it really the coconut oil? But we decided to keep it going. And so every morning in the beginning, he would get a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. And then I started cooking with it and got every recipe I could get my hands on, and eventually added MCT oil as well because it's more ketogenic. So we incorporated both into his diet. And we saw steady improvement over about a 9-month to 10-month period where he went from the day before not even being able to draw a clock. And if we were gardening, for example, he couldn't remember if he was digging a hole or filling it in. He would get confused about the simplest things that he was doing. He had great difficulty finishing a sentence. And over a 9 to 10 month period, he improved so much. And one example of that is we were in a doctor's office. I was the one that had the appointment, and he sat in the waiting room. And there were Scientific American and other magazines on the table. And several hours after we left the doctor's office, he said, I was reading this Scientific American article about Albert Einstein, and he told me details about that. And it was just so profound to me that he had come so far that before he started using coconut oil, he couldn't remember if he was filling in a hole or digging the dirt out of it, and now he could remember what he had read, something that detailed several hours earlier. It was just really an amazing journey to see his recovery and reversal of a lot of his symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And one of the overwhelming things about it was now I have this information that nobody else knows. People need to know about this. They need to know about it now, and there are 5 million people in the United States and 30 million or so people worldwide, that have this problem, and they don't have time. When you have Alzheimer's, you progressively get worse. Normally there's no turning around. And I felt like people's brain cells were literally dying while I had this information. So it became really an obsession of mine to get the message out and to just let everybody know about it as quickly as possible.
One of the reasons we're discussing fat in this section on neurodegenerative diseases is that your brain is obviously the primary target in this group of diseases, and your brain is more than 50% fat. In fact, you're a fathead. I bet you didn't know that, but you truly are. So it makes perfect sense to understand that it's not just any fat that you can eat. As we mentioned with Ansel Keys, and he made that mistake of not making the differentiation factor between healthy and unhealthy fats. So we want to help you understand the best fats that you can eat. So toxic fats would be pretty much any extracted vegetable oil and canola oil for a variety of reasons. And they're even worse when you heat them. They form not only trans fat, but these cyclic aldehydes, which just become far more dangerous. So stay away from pretty much any heated or fried vegetable oil. That is, you are just asking for trouble. So what happens when you eat these fats? And our cell membranes actually serve as capacitors to store our body voltage. And when we input the wrong types of fats, damaged fats, fats that are essentially plastic, they cannot serve this functional role as a capacitor. And when you limit or lower your body's ability to store body voltage, then you decrease your ability to repair, regenerate, and also have the energy you need to function in your daily life. In cyclical ketogenic diets, you want to consume somewhere between 60 to 85% of your diet as healthy fats.
What would be your message to people out there that are suffering with Alzheimer's or have a loved one, particularly with loved ones with someone with Alzheimer's? What would you say to them?
I would say that to look at nutrition. Look at nutrition as a guide to trying to get better, and very specifically to look at ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, and looking at ways that you can increase ketones in the blood. Exercise can do that. Taking foods like coconut oil and medium chain triglycerides can do that. Reducing the carbohydrate in the diet can do that. So that there are things that can be done that could increase fuel to the brain, which is extraordinarily important in Alzheimer's disease. And for people who want to prevent it, if you have a family history of it, you need to know that this process could be starting 20 or 30 years before you have symptoms. So reducing sugar in the diet, I think, is just extraordinarily important, and looking at ways to increase ketones, since they can provide alternative fuel for the brain.
If you're young, healthy, and not showing any signs of brain degeneration, you might be tempted to think this is not something you actually need to worry about. But right now is the ideal time to be putting into place habits and lifestyle changes that will ensure that you can prevent the devastating effects of these terrible diseases from ever touching you or your family.
Essentially what we see is that the problem with things like Alzheimer's or even Parkinson's is diagnosing Alzheimer's by dementia is equivalent to diagnosing type 2 diabetes when someone's on dialysis. Right? By the time that happens, they've lost so many neurons. But what leads up to that? A lot of it we think is basically impairment in the ability to take up glucose into the brain. And that happens early on. Like sometimes you could be in your 30s and that starts to happen. And so just like we do blood glucose tolerance tests as a screening for type 2 diabetes, I feel like people in their 30s should be getting these screenings for essentially glucose uptake into the brain. And then if we know early on, oh, this person's at risk, because if that's happening over time, they're going to lose neurons, and eventually, boom, they're going to have these issues. And so, or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And again, you don't want to diagnose it by the time you see those symptoms pop up. You want to treat it early.
I'm writing a book about this. The book is titled Alzheimer's is Not a Disease, which it isn't. It isn't a disease. And it's just it's the end stage, nothing unexpected about it, nothing unpredicted about it, of a decades-long progression, negative change progression that ultimately results in a catastrophe. And as soon as they called it a disease, 12 years ago, they put everybody off on thinking that when you have it, you treat it, as opposed to how you should think about it, and that's to stop the decades-long progression. That's really how you should be dealing with it. You should be stopping it from ever happening in life. But we don't think about it that way in the mainstream of medicine.
You believe that Alzheimer's can be prevented?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Or you could say delayed for probably indefinitely in most people. But I also think that when you do that, the changes that you drive in the brain will lead to substantial increases of longevity.
With it becoming clear that the precursors to many illnesses could be starting 10, 20, or even 30 years before they actually become obvious, why is it that more people aren't aware of this?
It's serious because Alzheimer's disease takes 30 years. You're 30 years old. So you've got 30 years now before the earliest likely development of Alzheimer's disease in your case. Are you taking care of yourself now? And if so, you're probably, if you continue, you're going to increase the chance of putting off, of prolonging the period that you're living with a healthy cognitive function. But that means you're going to be putting off cancer, you're going to be putting off hypertension, you're going to be putting off type 2 diabetes, you're going to be putting off obesity. So the things that take care of those diseases that strike between 30 and 50 or 30 and 60 are going to help slow down the onset of Alzheimer's disease as well. So prevention is a package, and it affects multiple diseases. It doesn't just affect Alzheimer's disease. It affects the diseases that in turn increase the chance of getting Alzheimer's disease.
The problem is also a metabolic one. The Alzheimer's patient is hypometabolic. Actually, the neurons are dying. So, and that's a hypometabolic problem that is mostly environmental. Yes, you have a few people that have a genetic predisposition to this, you know, and they have these different mutations, but they represent a very few. Most of it's environmental. So what are we doing in our environment that is contributing to the degeneration of neurons in the brain? You know, we're focusing on the pathology. But you know, there's certain groups of Alzheimer's patients who have pathology, plaques and tangles, and they are perfectly lucid. You would say this, you would look at this brain after, and you say, oh, this guy's got to be demented. They're fine.
Isn't it amazing that what this research is saying is that most of Alzheimer's is caused not by genetic predisposition, but by lifestyle and environment? This means that there is hope for so many suffering with Alzheimer's and other neurological disorders, and for those that have had loved ones that have suffered through it and are worried about their own predisposition to this horrible disease. We don't have to sit by powerless. We can take action to reverse and prevent this disease through simple lifestyle and diet changes. Lifestyle, not genes, have the power to control our destiny. We have the power.
Neurologic conditions, much like cancer and heart disease and all these other diseases, have really been slow to mature into a science of healing, largely because we keep focusing on the target rather than the environment around the target. If you have a neurodegenerative condition, the obvious target as a scientist is to say, what's wrong with the neuron? The amazing science that we've started to really untangle over the last 6 years, though, is really around the reality that if you don't have an ecosystem of bacteria and fungi and really plugged into your nature around you, you're not taking care of the nursemaid-like environment for that neuron, and that's how it ends up damaged. So the problem as to how anything from autism in the child to Alzheimer's dementia in the adult occurs looks to increasingly be around this dysfunction or collapse of the ecosystem of the bacteria and the fungal elements and all of these things that are naturally in your environment when you're outside. When you pull us out of that nature and you stick us in drywall boxes and air-conditioned offices and air-conditioned plastic cars, we are so isolated from that environment. Our science group has really been working over the last 6 years to really understand how that removal from nature is accelerating all of these neurologic conditions in our environment. And the answer is pretty profound. The bacteria and those fungi are turning on and off genes within the nerves of your brain, within the peripheral tissues of your body, by little signaling mechanisms. They're called microRNA. And those on-off switches are dictating how your brain or how any cell in the body is going to manifest health or disease. And so the relationship now between the bacteria and the fungi and these little on-off switches that they put into your bloodstream to help change and turn on that larger environment of the human brain is this new frontier for us to understand. And so increasingly, I think as we think about anything from the autistic child to the Alzheimer's, front line is going to be nutrition all day long. And so if you do an anti-inflammatory diet with intermittent ketogenesis or ketosis, you're going to reach a point where you really actually don't have the inflammatory backdrop or the breakdown in communication from the bacteria that are going to drive that neurologic collapse. So step one is get back in touch with the outside world, let the bacteria and fungi start to thrive again in the body, and then really support that extracellular space, the stuff around the neurons, if you're going to achieve stabilization of that neurologic condition and then eventually a healing process.
And it's not just genetic degenerative brain diseases that can be helped through the use of a ketogenic diet. Even individuals suffering brain trauma are seeing incredible results through this same approach. Do you believe that this is possible? Do you believe that people can have recovery from really extreme forms of concussion.
There's a lot of animal studies with traumatic brain injury where you're seeing drastic improvements relative to like not having ketones or not being on a ketogenic diet or not using a fasting protocol. Like all the combination of those things seems to speed recovery from traumatic brain injuries. There's a lot of animal studies that are on that right now. Our lab right now is looking into this as we speak. So that data, actually this time next year, this conference will likely be presenting that data here. You know, so yeah, there's definitely a lot of research, particularly, like I said, in animal models showing that, you know, if you have brain trauma, you should have this. I think that if you're an NFL athlete, you should be drinking it before you get a head trauma. If I were an NFL athlete, I'd be on a ketogenic diet simply because it's a prehab technique and there's so much head trauma. You know, and then even from a personal standpoint, my dad, for example, my dad was a firefighter, and of course he would come home with injuries all the time. And so, you know, he even head trauma, severe head trauma. And from one thing he got at one time, you wouldn't have known he had it like afterwards, but like conceptually, my dad would say like, it's like I have a head cold all the time, and it won't leave me. And so even though like he functions fine, you wouldn't even know he had, but himself. And then now he's been on a ketogenic diet like the last 3 years. And I talked to my dad the other day and said, "Hey Dad, how is it? How's that feeling?" Because I don't have it anymore. You know, and he couldn't sleep ever since he had that head trauma very well. He's sleeping great now. You know, so it's great to see it in the lab, and that's awesome. But I think again, like we're human too, and when it affects our lives and those around us, I think that's just a phenomenal thing to see.
Now, as a neurosurgeon, I have the privilege of being able to actually see into people's brains. And in the early days of neurosurgery, when we had to operate on a brain, we used to make a large window in the skull so we could see a large part of the brain. The advantage to seeing the brain, you realize when you see portions of the brain with your naked eye and see yourself actually taking parts of that brain out and then seeing the patient recover, you suddenly recognize that other parts of the brain are capable of taking over some of the functions that have been lost by the hemorrhage or by the surgical intervention. And that is all due to the brain's plasticity. So as a neurosurgeon, I've always had a great receptivity to this concept of plasticity. One of the most remarkable things that affected a lot of my career later on was during my training years. As a young surgeon, a resident, we used to do rounds on the patients in the hospital. And the professor would stop in front of a bed and ask the group questions about the patient. Talk to us about the patient, what was wrong with the patient, how would you treat this patient, and we'd do this from bed to bed. Except one bed, he'd always bypass it. And he would say, "Oh, this woman's in a coma, we don't need to stop here." And that bothered me. She was a young woman, she must have been in her mid-30s. So after rounds and everybody dispersed, I'd come back to her bed and I'd sit by the bed and just watch her for a while. And I'd do this every day for about 20 minutes to half an hour. And one day I started talking to her. Got no response. And I tried this again. And then one day she opened her eyes and she looked at me. And it looked as though she was kind of aware that I was there. And this went on for several days, and then eventually I'd ask her questions, she'd start answering, yes, no. And within a few weeks she began talking. And this by now, about 3 months had gone by. So I said to her, you know, do you remember anything from the last weeks, days, months that you've been here? And she said, yes. I remember that damn professor saying I will never wake up. And I was determined to prove that he was wrong. Boy, that stuck with me. That's one of the things that led me into becoming a specialist on coma and coma arousal techniques. That was a very, very, very powerful moment. It's been very successful over the last 40 plus years. I think I brought thousands of people out of coma. Some of them doing very well, some of them only getting partially better, but living at home, having a different quality of life than if they had been sent to a nursing home. The techniques involve several modalities of approach. These have to be considered as total individuals, not just a brain. And even though we're treating the brain, we want the brain to recover, we have to treat the entire body. So to arouse somebody from a coma involves, number one, making sure they have appropriate nutrition. We're back to nutrition again. Number two, ensuring that they get sufficient movement, even if it's passive movement. Passive movement means having a therapist come in or a relative come in and exercise their limbs so they don't tighten up on them. And then, very importantly, program of what I call multisensory stimulation, using the different senses in the body to stimulate all the different senses in a very systematic fashion, one after another, and repeating that over and over again, multiple times a day. Doing this until you start getting responses, and then when you start getting responses, depending on the response, you change that modality of stimulation. Just to give you an example, an individual who's lying in bed in a coma, who's not opening or moving their eyes, you might hold an eye open and shine a very bright light into it repeatedly, just a very brief flash, until you get a reaction. The way one normally sees a reaction to bright light is that the pupil, which is the dark part of the eye, constricts. Just like when we're out in bright light, the back of the eye becomes very small, becomes pinpoint. When you get that reaction, then you can start shifting to less bright lights, then presenting them with black and white images, and progress the sensory stimulation depending on how they're progressing. Same with the hearing, same with the sense of taste, same with the tactile senses. So it's a progressive program that's tailored to the level of responses.
But the power of such treatments are yet to reach the majority, and many illnesses are simply exploited by Big Pharma, something that Zach Bush says will cause an Alzheimer's epidemic. We have an impending tsunami of Alzheimer's that we're approaching, and conventional medicine has admittedly no effective treatment for this. So we're here today with Dr. Zach Bush, and he's going to provide us with some strategies that can address Alzheimer's and also improve optimal brain performance.
There's so many facets, and you've become expert in many of these, and the first thing is not to get overly frustrated at yourself. If you start to feel like your mind is not processing information in memory, it's important for you to keep the emotional trauma out of the scenario, because once we start to develop that frustrated hopelessness of I have dementia, then it can really snowball on us quickly. Movement is so critical, and the new German medicine that has really been exciting. What I would really recommend people look into is something called the Smovey ring, S-M-O-V-E-Y. The Smovey ring you can find online and order these. They are basically about the circumference of a tennis racket, about a half circle, and then a handle in the middle of it. And running in this tube are vibrating balls that will stimulate the neurons when you're walking. And it's that vibration or stimulation that gets these neurons back activated and talking back in community. And so you can be frustrated at your brain up here, but realize that brain is attached to this hand out here. And so the more you move, the more exercise and stimulation you give your peripheral nerves, the better you're going to preserve that central nervous system. And so huge data coming out of there on that front. So move, move, move. Other side of the spectrum of the globe is Japan. Japan's research right now in hydrogen is mind-blowing. They developed this technology really first for Parkinson's, but now it's being applied to all of the neurodegenerative diseases. And hydrogen is becoming recognized as one of the most critical antioxidants or inflammation reducers out there. And it goes after a very specific niche. It's what we could call a selective antioxidant. And that hydrogen is made by the bacteria in your gut, number one. And so the healthier your ecosystem in your gut, the more hydrogen you make. There's also technologies out there to help your water you're drinking to increase the hydrogen content. So these are a couple of major pieces. Move, move, move. Get the bacteria booming in your gut making hydrogen, and get the water and hydration piece back in to this hydrogen reality. So those are two major pieces that come to mind.
So thanks for those tips and insights. Isn't it amazing how simple the answer to what appears to be the world's hardest question actually is? One of the biggest advantages of these contrarian treatments is their accessibility to the masses. Those suffering with health problems have many opportunities to learn and inform themselves about natural, healthy, safe alternatives to their illness, thanks to the internet, and one of those people is Rich.
So Rich is an amazing story of resilience and really almost kicks back to something that feels like an old cowboy western or something, the way he survived. He woke up in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, on a property very isolated down in rural Virginia, and he had had a pretty significant stroke. He had really wiped out all of his muscular function on his left side and was unable to move at that point. He was in and out of consciousness.
It was the middle of the night. I found myself on the floor on all fours. So now I'm basically a puddle on the floor. I couldn't crawl. I couldn't get to my cell phone, nothing.
He really thought he was going to die at that moment and decided there was no way that anybody was going to be able to save him. If he was going to survive, he was going to have to go after this himself. And so with his right arm being his only functional piece, he was able to drag himself slowly to the door of this little house, opened the front door, and dragged himself out into the snow. It took almost 3 hours for him to get about 60 feet out into the snow. At this point, he was still a quarter mile from the main road, and dawn had come on, and he just knew he couldn't make it any further. He was too weak and too cold to move any further, and he just started calling out for help. And a neighbor happened to be walking his dog near his property and heard him calling, came out down the driveway, saw him collapsed in the snow, called 911, and his son came and they mobilized him. By the time he got to the hospital, he was in a complete coma state, unresponsive. He remained in a coma for almost a week, and when he woke up, he was fully paralyzed, the whole left side, very weak on his right side. He couldn't swallow, couldn't talk, couldn't urinate normally. He had catheters and tubes in every orifice of his body. He was really at the end of life.
I mean, I lost my whole left side to the point where I couldn't even swallow. They had put a feeding tube in. They told my children, after I was life flighted to UVA, best I was going to be able to do was in a walker dragging my left side. And that's what the conventional medical people said at that point to my children.
And there was a telling time when we rode up the elevator together in the hospital. He was laid out in his bed and had tubes everywhere, and he was going back for brain imaging. And we just had a discussion about, either he can check out now and he can give up and let his body go, or this is his opportunity to show his family and his grandchildren the most incredible journey that a human can take and the most courageous thing somebody can do, which is go after health and healing when there is zero odds. And so he took that as a massive challenge, and from that point on, I've never seen him relent. He has been just a machine of health and healing energy since then, and he, everything from nutritional control of his environment to just his incredible dedication to physical therapy, from the big effort of just standing for the first time months into this process to the fight to get back the tiny control of his fingertips again and everything else.
When I got out of the hospital, in a very short time, I got myself up to where I was walking 3 miles a day, okay? That's pretty much unheard of. And so that was my main therapy. I'm really hopeful that I am able to set that example for my grandchildren, that they'll be able to see me from where I was to where I am now, and even better. I want to be able to get out there and play tennis with them and do some of the things that I used to like to do.
The extraordinary story of Rich is he's now running his own household. He's got his own place near the original home he built. He still owns that home that he built and looks forward to moving back in there in the next year. And he's really gotten back to, as you've seen, just full function. He's just a really resilient human being, brilliant mind, engineering mind, ready to fix anything. The most amazing story about Rich is what he's done with his life since then. He's really had a spiritual awakening in himself since this event, and really found, I think, for himself, from my perspective, love of God and love of self in a way he had never perceived it before in his life. He started collecting day-old bread from some of our high-end bakeries up in the Charlottesville area and distributing them to the poor and people who couldn't get out of the house or whatever it was. This became so successful so quickly that it had to scale up to his whole church, and so his church now is delivering thousands of loaves of bread a month throughout the community to people that are in need. So just an incredible example of somebody who not only found health and healing for himself, but took that to another level to go out and impact his community in a positive way. Currently, 1 in 2 males in the United States of America are diagnosed with a cancer before they die. That doesn't even count skin cancer. We're talking about solid tumors here. And so we've got an incredible epidemic of this disease process in the community.
It's a tragedy. I've said it will probably go down as the single greatest fiasco in the history of medicine. Nothing else in the past would ever match what this cancer situation has created here. Nothing in the past history of medicine will ever be compared to the inadvertent death of these millions and millions of people based on a flawed theory.
The thyroidectomy and the removing of the lymph nodes didn't actually take down the cancer marker.
Right, my marker actually went up.
Do you think that it was not essential for you to get those surgeries?
I would have rather taken a more natural approach, but honestly, I didn't know anything about this. I just kind of did whatever my doctor was telling me to do, and that's kind of how it all happened. And actually, my endocrinologist, I asked her at one point if she really knows what she was doing for me. She really didn't know how to handle a case like mine.
And so I stumbled on this book which laid out this wonderfully elegant alternative theory for cancer, just packed full of evidence that I didn't know existed, 100-year-old evidence all the way to today, that laid out this alternative theory that cancer is not an exclusively genetic disease, but it's a disease of altered metabolism.
There's a conversation that's changed. There's a deeper understanding that there's a lot more to cancer than just the tumor or the tumor cell. There are finally recognition that there's a metabolic aspect to this condition.
So I was diagnosed in 2008, so it's the malignant melanoma in the eye, and so they suggested that I do Avastin injections this time round to stop angiogenesis, or that the other option was to take the eye out. And I went for the third option, the ketogenic diet. So we very quickly saw that it had an effect. My extraocular tumor completely disappeared. It's gone. And the tumor inside the eye is a fibrous mass. It's not active.
I am what you would call totally healed. My PSA has dropped down to levels that are described as indetectable, and they have been there ever since. The tumors, the 16 tumors in my liver and the other tumors abounding between here and here, have completely disappeared.
He had a complete healing event. In the Western medicine world, we call those miracles because we don't have a way to really wrap our head around what happened there. But we get to see enough miracles now happening around our clinic and everything else that I'm confident that there is a biology unfolding that tells a pretty cool story.
If you, like me, have been inspired by the powerful stories of healing and compelling scientific evidence that has been shared in this episode, and about how the ketogenic diet, the cyclical ketogenic diet, and other simple lifestyle changes can have a remarkable impact on the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, epilepsy, autism, and so many others, you won't want to miss out on our next episode where we discuss how many of the same principles can be applied to the treatment of cancer. You'll be amazed at the astounding results that we're seeing time and time again.
Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and if you've enjoyed the Diet Against Disease series, then I know you'll love to take the next step on your journey to optimal health. My new online course based on my best-selling book, Fat for Fuel, will help teach you to do just that. You'll learn how you can help implement the things you've seen in Diet Against Disease series, like the cyclical ketogenic diet, removing toxins from your life, and restoring your microbiome, and so much more. When you purchase the course, you'll gain immediate access to 7 comprehensive lessons that teach you the keys to help fight chronic disease, help manage cancer, and optimize your health. The knowledge from these courses has the potential to help change your life and empower you with all the tools you'll need to implement a healthy, disease-fighting lifestyle for yourself. Normally, this course costs $299, but if you act today, you can get it for the limited time discount price of just $199. All you have to do is click the button below and sign up today. By doing so, you will be taking an important step to help you and your family take control of your health. Please consider supporting us in continuing to get this message to the world. You'll also unite with us in our mission to save even more lives as we donate a large portion of all sales to charities, including Dr. Seyfried's groundbreaking cancer research, which could change the way the entire world treats cancer. Together, we can make a difference and begin solving some of the world's most frustrating and devastating medical issues with sound, natural, safe, effective, low-cost health principles. So take action now, and let's help you live the life you envision for yourself and the benefit of your loved ones.